The African Union has this week been celebrating its 57th anniversary, having come into existence first as the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in May 1963. To commemorate the event, political leaders on the continent have been sharing their thoughts on the journey thus far. Namibian President H. Gengop believes that so much has been achieved in terms of attainment of stability and peace, improved democratic institutions, and in his words, most importantly, an Africa free from incessant civil wars. But how true is this against the backdrop of recent economic and socio-political upheavals in Africa? We're now going to look at this matter in greater detail by speaking with Ambassador Jibrin Chinade, a former permanent secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, former special advisor Foreign Affairs to the late President Muhammadu Yar'Adua, former Nigerian ambassador to the Hague, to Sierra Leone, and also the Central African Republic, among several other postings during his 25 years in service. Your Excellency, welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us on the Morning Show.
Good morning, Ambassador. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Ruben. Thank you.
Morning, Your Excellency. Welcome.
Before I start, I think... Thank you.
You were going to say something. Please go ahead.
Yes, I said before I start, I think I will make one or two corrections on your introduction. I spent 35 years in the Nigerian Foreign Service, and I was also, my last post was Nigerian ambassador to the Soviet Union, Russia.
Well, that's noted, sir. Thank you very much for the correction. Now, I mean, we're celebrating 57 years of the African Union, formerly the Organization of African Unity. The African Union having been established on May 25, 1963. And yesterday, there was a virtual conference by African leaders, and the theme was about silencing the guns in the context of the COVID-19. How relevant and instructive is the theme of silencing the guns, considering the fact that we're in the season of COVID-19? Are the guns still booming in Africa despite COVID-19?
You see, in 1963, the African leaders met in Addis Ababa to establish the OAU, Organization of African Unity. I have here a copy of the charter of the organization. The main purpose of that union or unity is to establish peace, cooperation, and development. At the moment, Africa is facing a number of challenges. Like, as you have rightly emphasized, the issue of peace, unity, and the guns. Of course, the current gun in the world and in Africa in general is the coronavirus. It's like a gun itself, and is affecting Africa in a big way, and the world in general. So I think the challenges will always be there, but the African leadership must be able to take on the challenge and review it within the limits of its resources and level of international cooperation.
Ambassador, now still staying on the theme of silencing the guns and looking into a lot of civil unrest that we've seen across the continent for quite a while. Following the Arab Spring, what we really saw in Africa was an uprising in terms of weaponry. We saw a lot of weapons being sold on black markets at extremely cheap prices, and this was also boosting insurgency across the continent. Now, I wanted to ask you, Ambassador, because these wars may not be as clear as past civil wars that we've seen, but how do we need African leaders to start addressing this? Because it's true, it's there, and something needs to be done.
I think initially, in the early 60s, the African leadership seemed to have underlined or underplayed the issues of national developments. You see, Africa started at independence in the early 60s with only 3 countries, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Liberia has been independent. But since then, now we have over 55 sovereign, independent African countries. They have first and foremost to consolidate their national statehood. The process of nation building has been the greatest problem in Africa. The civil wars, the guns, and the issues you are raising are all related to nation building, the process of consolidating a national state. Take, for example, even in our own case in Nigeria, we are still talking about nation building, process of constitutionalism, process of democracy, process of elections. It will take a long time for us to silence the gun as long as these issues of democracy, nation building, and the problem of the economy is not all well addressed by the current or the past African leadership. But it's a process. Political issues are never solved overnight. We have been independent now for almost 65 years. And it will take quite some time for us to solve some of these very serious issues of guns, of health, of education, and of economic development. It's a process that will continue, and I think the African leadership is addressing it as it comes along their way of supporting their own people.
Well, you've talked about nation building and economic development, but if we were to break this down, what will you define as the root causes of conflict in Africa? And what are the implications for the politics of integration, particularly in the light of the move towards the African Continental Free Trade Agreement? The leaders, you give them some credit, but some people will say that leadership is the biggest problem in Africa.
Yes, I think I could remember once I had a very big debating argument with our least distinguished Maitama Sule at a public forum. He kept on emphasizing leadership. I said, sir, the issue is not only leadership, but followership as well. The leadership are produced by the Africans themselves to produce their own leaders. And this followership have their own interest, have their own values. It's the value of the followership that produce the leadership. If we really want to address some of these problems, we have to start by accepting that the nation states are here to stay. I could recall in the early 60s, the first decision of the OAU was to accept the colonial boundaries of African states, to say that this may not be something that we had held a referendum to accept it, but let us stay as we are today. And once you start questioning the boundaries, the ethnic composition of the states and so on, you will have a huge problem. And Africa, for the last 60 years, has been addressing the problem of nation building. We are still in it. It will take quite some time. But at the same time, we also have to address the problems of the people, which is the economy. The economy is the lifeline of the people producing the leadership. The leadership are produced by the followership. So don't all the time blame the leadership. The followership also have some responsibility in the affairs of their states.
Certainly, Ambassador. And speaking of the economy, I mean, the first type of freedom that a lot of people experienced in Africa was when a lot of countries got independence. But Africa is not wholly liberated. At the end of the day, neocolonialism lies in the fact that Africa is not economically free. And this is something that, of course, a lot of African leaders are looking at ways to address. One way in which that isn't being looked at, like Dr. Abati rightfully mentioned, is, of course, the Africa Free Trade Area Agreement, Continental Area Agreement. What other ways, what other measures would you like to see our leaders adopting to really and truly make sure that Africa becomes an economically free continent, liberated continent?
I think we first have to accept that the world economy is global. To emphasize that Africa must be on its own is not a solution. We are living in a global world. We are living in a scientific world. Science is universal. Science has no boundaries. You know, sometimes you hear that somebody is trying to invent a car in Nigeria. I keep on laughing. I say, what is he inventing? There are cars all over the world. So the issue is not question of isolation. It's question of cooperation and international level in economy, in science, in education, in trade, in health. So let us not, African countries, close their borders. No. We in Africa should not close our borders, but we should seek for cooperation. In fact, one of the solutions the AU has discussed about a few years ago, to be exact, 18 years ago, was NEPAD. What is NEPAD? NEPAD is to bring Africa to cooperate with the industrialized world, to cooperate with itself, and to cooperate with its own people to find an economic solution for its own salvation. I think the African leaders should not waste too much of their time to say they have to be taught, no country is independent. No. We should learn to cooperate, we should learn to borrow, we should learn to learn the scientific achievements of the developing countries. Let me give you an example. When we were in the primary school, the laughing stock was to say, made in Japan. Japan accepted total industrialization, total cooperation with the Western countries, and Japan now is one of the richest countries in the world. Recently, South Korea was exactly the same thing. We are virtually at the same level with Nigeria. But they accepted foreign investments, foreign partnership, foreign trade, and now they are one of the biggest industrialized countries in the world. So for Africa and for Nigeria in particular, I would like to appeal to our leadership to see the need and the importance of international cooperation. We have to work with the world. We should not be in isolation. Africa should open up and meet the challenges of global economy.
Well, Ambassador, you just made a very strong case for globalization. But I'd like to draw your attention to Kwame Nkrumah's iconic speech on May 24,
yes.
1963, in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, where he made a case for Africa becoming a global powerhouse in the future. And in that regard, he spoke more about cooperation and collaboration among African states, such that Africa will truly become the last frontier for the entire world. But Leila raised the question about independence, and you looked at it from the globalization perspective. But how do you react to the concern that many African countries now are under the yoke of China, or what is described as the China death trap in places like Zambia, for example, like Djibouti, where we have seen the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese government further promoting imperialism in Africa. How should Africa engage the rest of the world, even in a globalized context? On what terms? And do we have the capacity to do so?
I am very glad, Ruben, you raised the China issue. I'm a great supporter of Africa cooperating with China. Let me tell you why. We have been under colonial administration for almost 75, 80 years in Africa. And the emphasis then was pure administration and colonialization. China was a very underdeveloped country before 1949. China now is one of the strongest economies in the world. How do they do it? By cooperation. They cooperated with all countries of the world. They took up science, education, and challenged the West. Now that China is challenging the Western dominance of Africa, everybody is complaining about China. I don't buy that argument at all. I don't buy it. Let us cooperate with China. Let us learn. Let us learn from them as we have learned from the Americans, the Russians, the British, and develop Africa. Africa has enormous resources. Africa has enormous talent. Africa has enormous size. The market now is 1.2 billion with a GDP of about 2.5 trillion. Africa can operate at equal level with China, with Russia, with Britain, with the European Union, with all countries of the world. Let us not get this scared that China is dominating Africa. African countries will say, we're independent. Let us negotiate. Let us negotiate effectively as sovereign states with China. Let us identify our national interest. Let us protect the African interest against China, but let us cooperate with China and take advantage of whatever they have to develop our own resources, as they have done the same to develop themselves. You see, the idea that the West is frightening Africa, I don't buy that at all. Africa is free to choose its own friends. Africa is free to make its own decisions. We say we are sovereign, independent states. Let us negotiate. Negotiation is an equal partnership. Let us identify the national interests of African state, protect it, and cooperate with China and develop and drive the maximum benefit of this cooperation. That's my appeal.
General fear that many have is that for some reason in Africa, of course, we always seem to get the shorter end of the stick with these relationships. Ambassador, we'll come back to China in the course of this conversation, but I'd like to bring Russia into this. You're a former ambassador to the USSR, and of course, last year in October, the Sochi Conference on Africa was held, and both President Muhammadu Buhari and President Putin of Russia promised, of course, that they were going to inject fresh blood into Nigeria's relationship with Russia and vice versa. Now, of course, with the current decline that we're seeing in the oil and gas industry, what are you expecting from this relationship, and what specific sectors can really take advantage of the relationship that we're developing with Russia?
I must say I'm very happy that you have raised this question. I was Nigerian ambassador for 6.5 years. I went to Russia as Nigerian ambassador to the Soviet Union. At the end of the day, when I left the country in 1997, I was Nigerian ambassador to 15 countries. Then the Soviet Union has broken up into 15 countries. I was there. I saw it all. I also know President Putin personally when I was in Russia, because I visited them in St. Petersburg in 1993. The cooperation between Nigeria and Russia has always been very, very extensive in terms of defense, in terms of Ajakuta, and in terms of students. When I was there, we had 53,000 Nigerian students studying in the Soviet Union or in Russia then. Most of them, almost all of them, were either studying medicine, science, and technology. We also had the Ajakuta. When President Babangida appointed me as Nigerian ambassador, he said, Jibrin, I'm sending you to Russia to reactivate Ajakuta, which was a very important part of our national economic development. I spent almost 6.5 years pursuing this issue, and it's extremely important that because Ajakuta project is almost 98% completed. And I took up this issue with the Russian government. The Russian Minister of Ajakuta Steel Development mentioned to me, said, look, Ambassador, we have almost completed the Ajakuta project. What you need are 3 things. Let me tell you the 3 things he emphasized. We need connection between Warri to Ajakuta by rail. At that time, there was no rail. You need iron ore. You need coking coal. Those are the 3 challenges of Ajakuta. I have followed this argument even yesterday. I was following the same argument. The president has only last week constituted a committee to follow up the Ajakuta challenge. and I welcome that. But until and unless we solve these three issues, that's the railway between the Warri port and the Jakarta, the problem of coking coal to fire the generators, and the iron ore, Jakarta will always remain a dream. Now the president has given this challenge to the Minister of Energy to take up. I don't know whether they have identified those three issues. And at the moment, what has changed? This project was started by President Shagari over 40 years ago. It's not a question of only three things, but the management. Please leave Jakarta to the private sector. The government cannot run it. I say it again, and I will repeat it again. No government in Nigeria will run Jakarta successfully as a government parastatal. Drop it. Bring in investment, partnership, either from China, from South Korea, from America, from Britain, from Germany, to come and run Jakarta. Jakarta is in Nigeria. We should not get scared or frightened that foreigners are in it. I visited the same establishment in Russia, the same sort of project they have put in Jakarta. At that place, they have 65,000 workers. 65. They have a university. They have all sorts of things. They are running a city of iron and steel. We cannot do it by government in Nigeria. Please, let us be more efficient. The world has changed. No government in Nigeria can run Jakarta. I followed the debate in the National Assembly. They keep on emphasizing that the government should invest $2 billion. For what? Get the private sector. The project is going to be operated in Nigeria. The people are going to be Nigerians. The employees will all work there. But let us not be myopic and narrow-minded to say that we will run Jakarta by ourselves. We have spent billions, and there is nothing to show for it. There is just nothing. Please sell it. Hand it over to the private sector. Nobody is taking it out of Nigeria. Let it stay in Jakarta. That's my contribution.
Ambassador, migration, particularly illegal migration, is one of the major challenges in Africa in terms of the relationship between Africa and countries of the North and also perhaps, Europe, notably, and North America. What can African countries do to check this tide of illegal migration, considering the fact that the European Union and the countries of North America all have different attitudes? You can even add Asia to it. Different attitudes to the influx of a large population from Africa.
I think the challenge there is both political and economic. Let us have peace in our own countries so that our people will legitimately work for themselves and earn a decent living. If there is peace, there will be no people trooping out. If we have no Boko Haram, you will not find Nigerians in Niger or in Chad. If we have peace, you will not find Ethiopians, Somalis, and Eritreans moving out to Europe. If there is peace, people will prefer first and foremost stay in their traditional homes and educate their families and their children. So let us have peace in Africa. Second, let us address ourselves to the serious issue of the economy. I think we have put too much time on politics. Even here at home, we spend too much time on constitutionality, regionalism, restructuring, true democracy, true federalism. There's nothing like true federalism. Nothing. Federalism is a concept of political idea. It's relative to the people, relative to the situation. So for anybody to talk to me about true federalism, true restructuring, is all nonsense. is relative to the history, culture, and political development of the country. But let us strive to live in peace. Let us strive to develop the nation state. Let us have an idea that the nation is for everybody. It's not for any particular section or particular tribe or particular religion or particular... The nation is for each and every one of us. Once you develop a good nation state, the people will be patriotic, compatriots. They will defend their country to the best of their ability, and they will not move out anywhere. But unless we address ourselves to nation building, to the issue of the economy and peace, we'll always have people going out of Africa. But going out sometimes is also beneficial to these countries, to our countries. When you go out as a student, when you go out as a businessman, when you go out to learn skills and technique and technology, you can bring it back to your country and you contribute to the development of your own nation. So it's a mutual thing. But unfortunately, the traffic seems to be one way. We're all moving out to Europe instead of Europeans coming out. So let us be a mutual transition in and out, but for the benefit of each and every one of us.
Certainly, Ambassador. We only have about a minute or two to go, and I said we'd come back to China in the course of this conversation. Just very quickly, what do you foresee in terms of how US-China tensions are going to affect Africa? I mean, many analysts are warning of this becoming the new Cold War, and I'd like to get your opinion on that.
I like also that question. Yes, the COVID-19 issue has come into play in terms of foreign policy. The whole world is restructuring, readjusting itself to new foreign policy challenges. This is expected, this is natural. But we always have to benefit from our past experience. We have passed through the Cold War. Africa has been a victim of the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the Americans, capitalism and communism. We have passed that now. Now we are looking at the rivalry between China and America against African state. I think the emphasis should still be first and foremost for African countries to unite and identify their interest and defend it collectively. We can do that through two forums. We can do it through the African Union. We can do it at the United Nations. We can do it at sub-regional structures like ECOWAS, SADC, and East African communities and Maghreb. But African countries should really defend their interest against China, against America, but be in partnership with them. Well, partnership, cooperation, and development is the essence of the future diplomatic relations with all countries. Partnership,
thank you very much, Your Excellency.
And development. Not
thank
rivalry.
You, Ambassador.
Not rivalry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Thank you for joining us this morning on The Morning Show.